Recalcitrant radiance, oscillating for a brief mystical moment in the form of a wave, her wave, augments two distant points, a cave and a cave. Yamini, forged by the kiss of Dawa, witness to the archaeologist, antisynthesis. The crystal ball is split. Light work. Twist at the wrist in a cave. Floating world enchantment oozes until the darkness is full. Agile as a monkey in a whirling mist, the devil dances with a cross on his chest. Heavy breathing becomes a magic trick as the ocean slows. Again, his shadow reveals a forum of underhandedness, restrained by a chain of light. A light lie, a sleeping dog. It would be Sloane's shell or noose or would-be parameters. Spears burn like a firehawk, splintering into a million pieces at the heart. Windward, forward, Antilia or your time, hecatomb havoc, time conquers all. Truth is stardust.
So, thank you, Dan, for starting with what I thought was appropriate, which was to start with your poetry inside of your show. And I know that, in this show there's a lot of images which I understand as parts of your work, and others which I am not so familiar with. So I thought it could be interesting to talk with you about the painting that is downstairs, which I think maybe some of you guys have seen if you were already through the show, which is called Untitled NSD. And from what I see, it looks like an image of Freddy Krueger.
Yeah, it is a reference to Freddy Krueger. It's kind of like a distant thing or an idea, but for me it's very present right now. The reference is a particular point in the movie at the end. It's like the final scene, and the young girl who has Freddy in her dreams, she realizes that she has to turn her back on him so that he kind of disappears. So it's her way of confronting fear. And this image for me is about that, confronting fear and the presence of fear and control within our times.
Yeah, I thought it was a really surprising and resonant image to encounter, which I haven't encountered in some time. And when I see Freddy Krueger, I also think about this, his obviously these gloves that he wears with the scissor, the blades on the fingers, not scissors. And I'm going to Edward Scissorhands. But there's something about that, like the way that you're using this symbol of fear, and also that the fear is connected to somebody who cuts things up, who cuts things into pieces that are supposed to be wholes. And I feel that that's also something I've often seen in your work, is the kind of, let's say, a resistance to forces that try to separate things into different parts and to deal with reality in a different way, to chopping it up.
Well, for me, it's kind of in opposition to the dream, and the essence of the dream, which is about not being able to control it. And in a way, it's similar to the title, Dreamtime. We understand, if we know about my local context and my cultural traditions, then you will understand that Dreamtime is a term that relates to imperialism and colonialism, in a way that it's a representation of a co-opting of the power within the dream, or the imagination that's associated with the dream. And if we can think about mythology in that way, or cultural traditions, then it's a disassociation from time. When they speak about the dreaming, they often use the word dream time. Time is a linear thing, and the way that the West relates to time is in opposition, or it's about control. So it's a way to separate those two things and allow them to exist in relation in a different way.
It's interesting because Freddy Krueger, if I can keep talking about Freddy Krueger, kind of haunts dream time. And dream time is a different experience of time where, rather than it being chopped up into linear units and measured, it's flowing in some kind of uncontrollable way. But inside of this flow is this specter that could come and chop up this flow again. So I don't want to get too interpretive here, but I just think that's very fascinating for me. And in a way, to me, that is how your works often work. Is like they bring an image back, and the image somehow has new associations now. It has associations already, but then it gains associations. And so I think like what I think is interesting in that is like, it's not necessarily about only what's being represented in the image. It's about how the image is actually acquiring meanings. And so in our moment, I feel that this Freddy Krueger image is somehow quite like apropos somehow to a feeling in the air at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the works for me are very divergent. You know, they offer this extension, or this expansion of like what the thing is, or the idea. For example, it relates to pop culture, a particular form of film genre that comes from the US, and it speaks to many things for me. But I kind of zeroed onto this kind of moment in the film that spoke to, like, I feel one of the key things that relates to control, and that's fear. And hopefully the parameters that have been set for these things, they can be understood in a continuum. So they're like, you know, we see them as these things that aren't static. This artwork will move through time and space, and it will gain association. And hopefully these things can be freed from their chains, or the parameters that have been set for them, and push back against this Western mode of kind of containing something or simplifying something.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we talk about like a different experience of time, I think that's an interesting moment to talk a little bit about where you are from, and how there could be a different experience of time based on your experiences and in a way your culture.
Yeah, I guess that, like, the idea of the dreaming, or, you know, time, or they connect to a mythology, and we have to kind of let go of, you know, our the simplification of something, and connect to the poetic in a way that is expressed in the unknown, or, for me, the oldest continuous culture on Earth, and how we can think about the power in artistic traditions, and how they underpin these cultural transferences, or these cultural traditions, that come through artistic traditions. And how does that sustain these cultures? But also it is like, you know, we didn't really have the same relationship to time. It's our relationship to time is nonlinear, and hopefully the paintings can express that they relate to the past, and for me they relate to the future and the present in that way. They're not these things that are separated or defined by where people propose they sit in linear time.
Yeah, reminds me of we were reading a conversation when we were preparing for this, where someone points out that in First Nations Australian cultures, the word for granny means your grandparent, and in some First Nations Australian cultures, the word for granny means your grandparent or your grandchild. And I think that somehow does something to my brain that allows me to somehow get a glimpse of an understanding of time that's somehow profoundly different from this accretive, progressive time of contemporary European and North American societies. But it also reminds me of this conversation which we had one time in Miami when we were doing the show there, the show that Dan was part of in Miami that I had worked on, and you told my father about this, about the oldest human-made structure that is known. And I wonder if you could explain that again, because I might screw up the details.
So yeah, in Western New South Wales, there's a fish trap that is, I think it's been dated at over 40,000 years, and I think you have to fact check.
We'll fact check it.
But it is the oldest man-made structure on Earth, or human-made structure on Earth. And you ask people what they believe it is, and they'll probably point somewhere else.
Yeah, I remember you telling my dad about that, because he told me, and I was very interested to see what it looks like, because I thought, my God, 40,000-year-old structure. We think of 4,000 well, in the USA, we think a 400-year-old structure is very, very ancient. But at least over here, maybe 4,000 years is super ancient. But 40,000 years was like way beyond for me. And so I looked it up, and the images that I found, what was really fascinating, I think, and that I think connects to my understanding of your work, is you don't immediately see that it's a man-made structure. It's almost as though it's a landscape that some people probably took for just a landscape that had not been molded by human beings. And yet, within this landscape are all of these complicated reroutings of the waterways through certain narrow places that basically, from what I understood, it almost kind of catches fish for you or something.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's probably why it still exists, with empire and colonialism, these structures that probably existed elsewhere were destroyed.
Exactly. So this quasi-invisibility almost is part of the longevity.
Yeah.
And I think that for me is a kind of I think looking at that was a kind of a key in for me to like a work like the Creek work that is on the wall here. And also when I visited you in north of Cairns, when I visited you in Cairns and we went to visit with your family, who I see here again after a while, and that landscape, I remember we walked up this creek where a saltwater crocodile lived, and I was like kind of petrified, but we were kind of standing on this in this mangrove on top of these roots, and then you said at some point, we shouldn't really go any further than this. And I remember thinking, well, I'm glad you're saying that, because I was already kind of feeling like I don't really want to get too close. to this animal, which, you know, I also found very interesting because it's an interesting way of inhabiting a place where there's an animal that, you know, could potentially be dangerous, but the way around that is to know about it and to understand its practices, and when it comes down the river into the sea in the evening and when it goes back. And then I remember you telling me that if someone would shoot this crocodile, it could become a huge problem, because then a young, aggressive crocodile looking for territory might move in, and now you have a much bigger problem than this predictable old saltwater crocodile. So I was very struck by this kind of, again, there's something like a kind of relation to this landscape, which is not just about controlling it through eradication, but is about dealing with it in a kind of almost like collaboration might be a bit strong, but something like a symbiosis at least. So anyway, I wonder what the source of the creek image is here. Because I feel like I've seen some land and waterscapes like this, but I don't know for sure where this is based on.
So this is Kukuyalanji country, and it's where my great-grandmother was from. And it's the oldest rainforest on Earth, the Daintree rainforest. And it's one of the most diverse places for living things on Earth. And the landscape, yeah, it's about your responsibility and understanding your relationship to the place and how you care for it. You know, how you understand your relationship or your responsibility to that place. The complexity, hopefully, is understood through the fact that there's so many things that we don't understand about this space still, and that's kind of a way for me also to connect to my ancestry and the thousands of generations that have existed in this place.
I mean, again, so you have the oldest human-made structure, and now we're talking about the oldest rainforest. Not necessarily being the oldest is better, but it's very interesting, I think, to somebody like me who, you know, grew up in the U.S. To realize that these things, which we don't, because if you would ask me where's the oldest rainforest before today, I probably would have thought it's in the Amazon, you know. And I think for many people, the kind of cultural imaginary supplies the Amazon as like the rainforest. But the fact that, you know, there's a rainforest that has potentially existed much longer, and that again relates to this kind of over a kind of longer time span. And in a way, it's interesting, I think, as people like you and I who practice in this field of contemporary art, to think about these time spans, because a lot of the history of art has dealt with quite short time spans, I think. And how can those time spans enter? So what I think is interesting in this show and in your work generally is like you can see an image like Freddy Krueger, and then you can see an image like this creek in this rainforest, and they're in some way they're kind of equivalent because they're being lensed somehow in your way. And you taught me a new word earlier today, which I wanted to bring up and maybe ask you to talk about, which is relates to this way of lensing called oculi.
Yeah, I mean, it's a plural of oculus, and it's kind of a dispersal of the singular into multiplicity and kind of giving equity to how we enter into something or how we perceive something. It started with the paintings, and it was a way for me to give equity to the image and allow it to be taken into the future in a way that doesn't contend with the singular or the kind of the simple definition of something.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I'm looking up at the oculus, which is covered in oculi, that you've done for the show here, and remembering this window that I treated in Brussels with this, and how it changes over the day and how it produces this constant relation to what's going on outside. I think that had a very big impact on me. And it's, in a way, allows you to focus on the play of light and the changing play of light without being able to apprehend it as one thing. So it's interesting to me that that's, in a way, you know, before we were talking about this kind of Freddy Krueger-ish Western tendency to chop everything up into separate pieces. And in this model of the oculus, or the oculi, it does separate things into, it separates light into many things which are somehow still one thing. And I think there's something complex in that move that I still don't fully, you know how to describe.
Well, I mean, everyone that's spent time, or everything that's spent time on this earth has had a relationship to the sun. But it's also about like the uncontrollable nature of, you know, the experience. You sit in the space, or you might visit it. At the moment, there's no light kind of penetrating the oculi. The power is in imagining what it can be. So hopefully that can contain or bring people back to the experience, so that there's power in the imaginary that, for me, has been challenged by, you know, the kind of speed in which we consume images or things today.
Completely. And it also reminds me of the focus in your work on light, you know, the play of light on surfaces, and the splitting of light, but the coming back together of light. It's, I don't know, it's something I've been thinking a lot about, because, you know, we talk about the Gaia theory, we talk about these ways of understanding the planet as a kind of system or a living system, and I feel that I got pushed a lot by coming to Australia, which I should mention basically came about because of you, having me invite, or not having, but suggesting that I get invited to visit Art Space with Alexi Glass-Cantor, who's over in the back there, and thinking about these more, how do I say this? These longer time scales in which energies have been passing through and around what we're experiencing. That's been very important for my work, I think, and that came kind of out of our becoming friends. And from you coming to be part of that show in Brussels now 7 years ago. And you know, the show in Brussels was focused on this idea of mondialité, like a global dialogue between places that is not necessarily going through the metropole. So it's not like, you know, us relating to each other through, you know, the metropole, but it's like a way to be able to relate through difference from one place to another. And in a way that something like that got established, I think, in that show. Certainly with Mantia Diawara and yourself, I feel still that the conversation we are having still kind of impacting me. I thought maybe we should play the clip that you showed me earlier.
But opacity is not.
We forced him to speak English here, and he hates this. He had no choice because somebody mistranslated him.
It's not a lack of light, because there is opacity.
You were at this conference, yeah.
When we don't really know from where the light is issuing or coming, that's the point where opacity can work. Opacity is the research of the origin of every light. So Opacity is the research of such a place, the place from where the light is issuing. Opacity is a signal for a place. When the place is difficult of access, that means when it cannot find its place, the place of the place, in relation and diversity. When the place is difficult to know, and when the place is difficult to understand, that means to delocate after it found its place, the place of the place. And finding its place, the place finds its liberty.
It's kind of amazing how this sea sound was coming into the, that's just magical. Well, anyway, that was Edouard Glissant talking about opacity, which is something that Dan and I talked about many times. But I don't know if you could make it out, but he was basically saying that, opacity is about delocating the light. Actually, maybe do a brief, what he, the thing he says about opacity that everyone repeats is that opacity is a quality that all human beings share, and it is the quality of not knowing who you actually are, or what it is that you don't know about yourself. And the fact that everyone has some aspect that they don't understand about themselves is the thing that connects people. So it's a kind of relation through difference. But in any case, in this case, I think he's getting at something much more related to light, which is why I think it was, important to have that moment, to hear him talk about that, to delocate light. And I feel like your work kind of connects to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's trying to shift how we perceive something usually, or to bring it into a trembling. And I guess that kind of speaks to the accumulation of things, or understanding that, yeah, like he said, the abyss only exists when you understand the inside and the outside of the abyss. You can't have one without the other. And I think hopefully this, the dispersal of the singular into the multiple can offer that.
Yeah, and I think also that touches on something which I think people don't always talk about with you, which is this relationship to the universe, to the astronomical, and to light, traveling across the whole of the universe, and not just necessarily this planet. So there's this kind of extraterrestrial side to your work too.
Yeah, it's definitely a part of it. Yeah, it's how we think about the expansion of the universe. Well, it's how I think about the expansion of the universe. It's like we can't contend with trying to comprehend that. It's something that I feel we'll be continually trying to understand, but sometimes it's okay to live in that space where you make peace with not knowing something, and that's enough. And hopefully that connects to the poetics of experience or relation, and hopefully we can think about it in those ways as well. That we can't, we can't pin those things down. they're too big.
Yeah, I think that in a way you touched on a lot of things that I was also thinking at this moment, in a slightly psychic kind of a way. So, but it brings me also to this work that's downstairs in the, I guess it's called the crypt, which is a work that it appears to be hands kind of manipulating a coin. And I don't know, there's something about that work invoking magic that I thought was interesting, and maybe you could talk about that too.
I think the thing that keeps people coming back to the work is they don't understand it. You know, they try to figure it out. They try to work the process out. How you break it down into things like how Freddie's trying to cut people up in these dreams. If you knew how these paintings are made, then the magic is lost. It's like a magic trick. If you knew how the magic trick is done, you don't come back to it. You understand it. You can move on. But I feel that the magic is key in helping people understand the poetics of something, or the illusion of something. Saying that, all of these works mean so many things to me and so many things to different people. And I express my relationship to these paintings. But it's also about how the audience is able to extend it or relate to it and contend with the extension of the idea or the thing that's within it.
Yeah, I have this experience as well when you deal with something that people bring their associations to, and you deal with, let's say, images or material entities and materials. When I go downstairs and I look at Magic Johnson on the Dream Team, I have all kinds of thoughts that come, that are coming to me. But also with much more universal things than, that's a pretty specific reference. And I think there's something about this idea of magic that you're invoking here, which is very deeply related to art, but not just visual art, something like in a longer span that, like I think you said something about to me, about song, mark making, and dance as three formats that are interesting to you. And I feel like all of those have also this play, which you could call a rhythm. Like if you could call, I would use rhythm as a word for another synonym for magic in this context.
It's just how we've sustained the oldest continuous culture on earth. It's through the artistic transference or the artistic tradition. And I think there's a power in that. Yes, it's the poetics and the power in how we relate to a story, but how we have a sense of authorship in that experience. They are poetic in essence, and we share a story, but we have ownership over it. When we do a dance, we might have a shimmy or do something that's our thing. But you bring your flavor to that thing, and then you have a sense of owning that tradition and then passing that on. So it's about your relationship to those traditions, but also the aura of artistic traditions and how we can use those forms of cultural transference in a way that is beneficial. So I guess it's probably a good time to talk about Apollo and this understanding of the myth and these mythologies that relate different things in the exhibition, but it's how empire co-ops or power co-ops mythology. And what it means when Petrus Camper uses an image of Apollo as the archetype of beauty in a scale of races. So you have in the painting downstairs, you have Apollo at one end and you have an orangutan at the other end. Or it's how they use this story of Apollo to talk about the mission to the moon. What does it do when the US plant their flag and take a photograph of their footprint on the moon, when all of these cultures around the world have so many associations that are about the imaginary or imagination? Hopefully, through these works, offer an expansion on that thing so that they're not stuck in how we understand them. How can we make them evolve in a way that has equity in their kind of makeup or in their essence? Yeah, how do we free Apollo from all of these things? Because it's beautiful, you know, these Greek mythologies are beautiful things, but how do you disassociate it from power and empire and control?
Yeah, it's an old question. I think when I went to Delphi and I saw there the Sibyl rock, which the basically kind of what, you know, witches or female priestesses of an earlier version of Greek religion were worshiping the Sibyl rock, and then that evolved into when this kind of Apollonian culture came, the priests would basically expose somebody to kind of to the sulfur that was coming out from the mountain there, and then they would have these, quote, ravings, which was convenient because then it meant that these priests could now interpret the ravings and make it say what they felt that they wanted to say. So, like, I think this idea of the co-opting of mythology, it comes very, very early, and even at the birth of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. So I think that effort to kind of free these images or to free these reference that's going on in your work is interesting also. From my perspective, it's interesting because it's not just something happening now. Like, it's something that's there happening in many moments, and it almost always requires a kind of like a continual reinvention of these things in order for them to achieve something like a kind of a new impact. And so I see, in a way, like what you're doing is kind of part of a line, even though it's changing that line. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's kind of in opposition to the ego, and hopefully thinking about the hierarchy of things and how we can give equity to that and allow it to move forward in a better space.
Yeah, I mean, because we're in Paris, I've been thinking a little bit about this old project of Jean-François Lyotard, which was not completed. He did a show in Pompidou as a curator when they were inviting philosophers to curate shows, which is very well known, called Les Arts Matériaux, the immaterials. But he had an idea for a sequel, which he didn't get to do. And the sequel was supposed to be called Resistance. And it was supposed to be about that which resists electrical current, rather than this kind of endless circulation of electricity in the air that the immaterials was about. And so, in a way, I think that, you know, seeing this show here also connects this idea of resistance to electricity, to opacity, to the body, you know.
But I mean, that's what Glissant was talking about, you know, opacity is resistance. And yeah, I think also this understanding of your relationship, or how you move through time and space. Like, for me, it's in that landscape. Like, there is an importance for First Nations people in our country to always, even if you've been dislocated from your country, is to always go back there and walk on your country and connect to that.
Yeah, it's like in that sense, this way, resistance, opacity, and grounding are somehow connected, right? To ground something means to allow electricity not to necessarily just fly off into the, uncontrollably. And in a way, we were talking about our friend Shumon Basar's critique of the way images circulate in the world right now, and how they circulate so easily that they break down the trust that you have when you see an image which might be like a testimony of something that's going on. And so rather than act based on seeing the image, you no longer act. It's in a way like I think he calls it a kind of like reality TV syndrome of images that are just circulating so fluently that they prevent any kind of action or they prevent any kind of engagement other than just consumption. And I think in some ways, like you're kind of like loading these images with a kind of darkness that weighs them down again, and get it's very paradoxical, but like that allows them to not so easily circulate or to move, but also to be seen through a lot of different lenses at the same time. So there's an interesting paradox that's going on there. Connects to the paradox that we started with about this kind of Western chopping up of reality versus this multiple lensing or something. And I think it's almost like a ballast what your work is doing to these images, to me.
Well,
something that holds something, not necessarily down, but that gives it weight.
I think it's a slowness.
Slowness, yeah.
Yeah, or a thickness. And I think there's a power in that. I mean, I think that's what art does, and it's in opposition to the bombardment of images in this time where we're desensitized to like what they offer, and the people with control know that, and it's about how they contend with the power of art and that slowness and the aura of art.